Hello, astrophotographers from all over the world. My name is Luis Miguel Azorin, and I welcome you to a new video from Astro Academy, your YouTube channel, your podcast, and your online academy about what we are passionate about: astronomy, astrophotography, and everything related to the universe and space. Once, while talking with a friend who is an astrophysicist, we were discussing the calibration shots taken at a professional observatory. He told me that above any other calibration shot, the most important ones were the flats, that you could do without darks and bias, but not without flats. That stuck with me, and I've applied it up to today. In fact, I can confirm that flats are the calibration shots that truly make the difference between a spectacular photograph, ready to process what could have been a great photograph that, in some cases, is simply beyond repair. Or we're going to have a really tough time during processing, so it's extremely important to capture flats. In our astrophotography sessions, we either set up our equipment in the field or have it installed in a hosting. What is a flat? It's actually very simple. A flat is a capture that we make of a bright and uniform background, which must be done with exactly the same distance parameters. Focal length, focus, aperture, if we are using a photographic lens with variable aperture, and the camera's rotation angle, as the light captures we've made of the deep sky object that we've photographed. This capture will generally show a white background and a series of spots and vignetting that will correspond to dust modes that our photographic equipment has, and the vignetting shown in the captures. What are flats used for? These captures allow us to generate a master, a stack, which will be divided by the stack of the light shots, enabling us to eliminate those defects, those spots, and vignetting from our astrophotographic stack, resulting in a flat image ready for processing. When is it necessary to capture flats? The quick answer would be after each astrophotography session, although this isn't always the case. If you have equipment set up in a hosting and you don't have a field rotator installed, you can create a library of flats, since the camera's rotation will always be the same. In any case, it's good to refresh that library of flats every so often, for example, every 3 months or every 6 months, depending on whether some dust particles have appeared on the sensor. And finally, if you set up and take down all the equipment in each session, and if you rotate the photographed field, then you'll need to capture flats in every session. And how are flats captured? Well, there are different ways to do it. One traditional method that has been used for many years is to photograph the clear sky at dawn, once the astrophotography session is over, which is known as sky flats. This system is still used by numerous astronomical observatories and also by some enthusiasts. However, the most commonly used system today by enthusiasts is the use of a flat panel, a backlit screen or sheet that is placed at the front of the telescope and allows for the capture of flats. So let's see how to get some good flats, whether with our portable equipment or remotely with our setup. Setup in hosting, with a flat panel and with N.I.N.A. Let's go to the computer. Here we are once again connected to the computer that manages my remote setup at the Astrogrados Observatory. In fact, we can see it over here. It's this equipment here on the left. And we're going to see from start to finish how to carry out this calibration capture completely remotely, because I'm over 500 km away from the observatory. To manage all the equipment and my captures remotely, I use the N.I.N.A software, which I have open here to be able to capture the flats. We don't need to have all the equipment connected, we just need to have the camera connected, which I have right here. I'm already cooling down to the temperature of -10 degrees, which is what I usually work at. The filter wheel, the focuser, and of course, the flat panel with which we're going to take the flats remotely. As I mentioned a moment ago, we can take the flats, or at the end of the astrophotography sequence, or if we don't take down the equipment, or if we don't have a rotator installed, we can take the flats at any time. And our goal is to get something like this that I have here. What I have here is a training session that I've done for the Optolong L Enhanced Filter for Automatic Flat Captures. Let's see how we achieve this optimal exposure time for any filter so that we can later automate the capture of our flats. The first step is to set our camera to the temperature at which we capture the light, and my camera is already working on that. The second step is to bring the equipment to the focus point as close as possible to the focus point we use to capture the light. So for this, I'm going to come over here to the focuser. So I'm going to extend the focuser. If we go to the camera, we can see how the focuser is extending right now. We already have the camera working at the temperature we were looking for, at -10 degrees. We have already located the focus point, so we are ready for the flat capture. To capture flats, we have a FLATS assistant on the left side, which is going to solve many problems when it comes to capturing our flats. This is the interface of the FLATS assistant. Let's take a closer look at it. Here, at the top, we have the name with which you will name those calibration shots, FLATS Wizard. In this case, I'm going to leave it like this. Here we have the number of flats we want it to capture and the number of calibration darks we want that it captures, because you'll know that when we work with a camera, we have to capture flats and we have to capture darks of those flats to calibrate them. The FLATS assistant is going to do everything for us automatically. Here we have the type of exposure, dynamic brightness, sky, flats. Something I just mentioned a moment ago. By default, it comes in dynamic exposure. We were going to leave it this way. Here we have the filter with which we want to capture the flats. In this case, I'm going to do flats with the UV filter and the Ricato. Here we have the vinyl, the gain, the post set. This data will be taken from what you have configured in the camera tab. And here we have the minimum exposure and the maximum exposure with which we want it to perform the flats. That is to say, between 1 and 5 seconds, the FLATS assistant is going to try different exposure options until it finds the most optimal one. Here we have the brightness of the FLATS panel, in this case 3100. This is the maximum brightness that my FLATS panel accepts. It doesn't mean that we're going to work at that brightness. Now we will have to adjust it exactly to the brightness that will allow us to achieve a correct exposure within this time range. And finally, we have the target histogram, meaning how we want the FLATS assistant to adjust the exposure to exactly locate the peak of the histogram where we want it. By default, it's 50% with a margin of error of 10% up or down. And now, I've told you that this here is the maximum brightness of the FLATS panel. It's the only parameter that we will have to adjust manually. In fact, if I launch it right now, it's total, and how it is with this brightness. I launched it. If we look here, we can see that the FLATS assistant has turned the FLATS panel all the way up. It has a lot of brightness. It's currently doing a series of tests, but since it has so much brightness, it can't even achieve it by lowering the exposure time very low. 1.0 feel out of 625 seconds, 1.03, 1.015. But even so, the histogram is still all the way to the right because the brightness is too high. I'm going to stop this. We can try different brightness levels until it finds exactly that brightness level that will allow us an exposure between 1 and 5 seconds, which is what we've set up. I'm going to set a brightness. For example, 200. And let's see what we get. With a brightness of 200, it's testing an exposure of 3 seconds. We have an underexposed histogram. Now it's testing 4 seconds, and we're still getting an underexposed histogram, 4.5 seconds. 4.75 seconds, and we're still getting an underexposed histogram on the right. If we check now, we see that the brightness level of the FLATS panel is so low that it's barely visible. So basically, we're going to have to find that brightness level that allows us to achieve that exposure. I'm going to set the brightness of the FLATS panel to 600, and we're going to try it now. Now, there we have the FLATS panel with a brightness of 600. And this is starting to look more like what we're looking for. It's setting up the exposure. 2.5 seconds. And he has found the optimal exposure level at approximately 2.5 seconds, which gives a histogram somewhat above 50%, because we've set a tolerance margin of 10%. If we want it to land exactly at 50%, we can set a tolerance margin of 0% or 5%. In any case, the flats you're going to get are perfectly valid, and they will work perfectly to calibrate your astrophotographs. So right now, what he's doing is taking 100 flats at 2.5 seconds with a brightness level of 600. And then, when he captures the 100 flats, he will turn off the FLATS panel to capture the dark flats. Let's see it. Well, he has already captured the 100 flats. He tells us that he's going to capture dark flats, so we need to cover our telescope. We say OK. And what he has done now is turn off the flats panel. So here we have the first dark flat, which I remind you must be exactly the same exposure as the flats. That's why it's very important that we capture flats and dark flats using the FLATS assistant itself. Or that we have these times calculated to set them manually within an advanced sequence. Well, with this, we would have our batch of flats and dark flats completed using the FLATS assistant. But the most interesting thing about this is that if we now go to the FLATS panel, here we have the U, V, and R cat filters with the optimal exposure time calculated by the FLATS assistant. So, we already have the FLATS capture training for this filter. In this way, we will not only be able to repeat the process, but if we go to N.I.N.A's advanced sequencer, we can create sequences like the one I have here, where, as you can see, I have instructions for the automatic capture of flats and dark flats. I have it right here. Trained exposure of flats with the L-enhanced filter and trained exposure of darks with the L-enhanced filter. Just here. You need to load the instruction, select the corresponding filter, for which you should have completed the FLATS training with the FLATS assistant, and you'll be able to create an automatic sequence for taking flats or integrate it into the capture sequence you have for a specific night. If you're interested in how this is done, I remind you that we have an entire episode dedicated to N.I.N.A's advanced sequencer in the Astro Academy podcast. I recommend you take a look at it. As you have seen, by following these simple steps, you will be able to completely automate the capture of flats in your astrophotography sessions and even integrate it into your capture sequence so that it can be done completely unattended, whether you're working with a portable setup or a fixed observatory setup. I hope this video has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next videos from Astro Academy.